Good morning. This is Betsy Hill, President of BrainWare Learning Company, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today. This is actually a re-recording of a previous webinar, and I just need to get my screen so that you can see it. We had some technical difficulties when my internet dropped off during the original recording, so we are going to go ahead and do this re-recording. You can access a copy of the slides that I'm using this URL that is on the screen. If you would rather, you could also send me an email, and I'd be happy to send that to you. I'll be sharing my email and my other contact information at the end of the webinar. So we are, in fact, recording this, and so you can feel free to share the link with others. If you are interested in receiving a certificate of participation for professional development purposes, you can also request that by sending me an email. And again, I'll share that information. So one of the questions that often arises when students are struggling is whether the cause of the struggles is academic or behavioral, because they often are happening at the same time. And so we asked the participants in the webinar, which of the two figures, figure A or figure B, best represents your experience. So you might, if you're watching this as a recording, you might think about this as well. So figure A says that most academic and behavior problems are independent of each other, not necessarily connected. Figure B suggests that most behavior problems, or it is most common for behavior and academic problems to be interrelated. So as you're thinking about what your experience reflects, I will tell you that we had very similar results both during the webinar and in a previous poll that we did in social media, which showed that in both cases, just about 80% of people felt that when students are experiencing problems, they are interrelated academic and behavior problems, so that figure B was the one that best reflected their experience. So here's a brief outline of our webinar today. We're going to look at the concept of integrating academics and behavior within a multi-tiered system of supports, something that many schools and districts are actively pursuing. Then we're going to take a look at cognitive skills as they relate to both academics and behavior, and look at the likelihood that there may be underlying causes for both academic and behavior issues. And while there are unique components to behavioral supports and academic supports, both systems involve clearly defining a problem, getting to the root cause. And the work that I've done with schools and businesses and in the MBA course I teach, I find that many people struggle with getting to a root cause, with clearly defining a problem in a way that is likely to yield an effective solution. So I'm going to be sharing some of the practices that I share with my students and clients and that I find to be most helpful. There are a variety of multi-tiered systems of support out in the world, and the Every Student Succeeds Act refers to them in a general way. Many schools have, for some time now, worked within an RTI, response to intervention model, to address academic issues. And many schools also have had behavioral support systems. Some of them are called PBIS, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. But very often those two have operated independently. Because of the interrelationships between the two sides, a combined approach just makes a lot of sense. And for those who are actively working on such an integration, there is a book out called Integrating Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, Blending RTI and PBIS. And the next slide actually has the name of the book and the authors, McIntosh and Goodman. And this book provides a very comprehensive, step-by-step approach if you are interested in working on that. This illustration was adapted from that book and shows both the unique characteristics of academic RTI and PBIS, as well as the common characteristics of the two systems. And what both systems share is a focus on scientifically based interventions, so those for which there is evidence that they are going to be effective, a tiered continuum of supports, so they get progressively more intense as students demonstrate that they need them, regular screening to identify students who may be at risk for one or the other or both, and a focus on learning and continuous school improvement. So this is a continuous improvement kind of process. And as we have said, a problem-solving model based on data. So there's been some work that has looked at the relationship between academic skills and behavior, and whether one is the original cause or whether the other is, or how they are interrelated. So one possibility is that there are behavior challenges that reduce access to instruction. So if you have a student who is acting out or tuning out or withdrawing or disrupting or whatever it is, then they're obviously not attending to the instruction that is being offered to them. And that behavior then will interfere with the student's learning. A second possibility is that there are underlying, and here the work of Colin Kriebel specifically identifies attention deficits. So underlying attention deficits could cause challenges in both areas. So attention deficits could lead to disruptive, impulsive behavior and lack of attention, as well as the lack of attention that will mean that they're not actually focused on the learning that they're supposed to be doing or to the instruction that the teacher is offering. And as we will see, and we'll discuss in just a few minutes, there are other kinds of deficits beside attention that tie into the root and can lie at the cause, the very foundation of both types of challenges. Another possibility is that a student is struggling academically, and as a result of that, experiences social rejection. And this could be less support or outright rejection by peers, also by teachers, and then that rejection because of their struggles with academics can become a social and emotional challenge. And finally, the academic interventions that are provided to students, if they're not effective, can also lead to behavior challenges. And this is probably a little bit unrecognized sometimes, is that we see students struggling and we provide supports, but then there starts to be a behavior problem, and sometimes that can simply be because we're not truly addressing the base of the problem, the core of the problem. And as students then start to continue to experience academic challenges, it's going to impact behavior just as in the same way as some of those early academic challenges will do that. So this is a chart that may help to explain why some of those interrelationships exist. The top level of this chart, of course, represents why we all do what we do to help students achieve life success. In schools, for the most part, the focus is on the next level, on academics, whether it's English language arts or STEM disciplines, other kinds of academics, or on social emotional learning, which is getting even more attention today than it has in the past. And underneath this is a whole infrastructure of skills and cognitive processes that need to be working well for students to achieve our goals for them and their goals for themselves, whether those are academic or behavioral. So it starts at the bottom with what we call foundational cognitive skills. These are the basic ways that information gets into our brains from the outside world. We have things like attention, visual processing, sensory integration, processing speed, simultaneous and sequential processing, some of our very short-term memory skills. So, for example, if students can't attend to what we want them to work on, the information is simply lost. But there are a variety of other skills at that level, including visual processing and the others that I mentioned, that need to be working efficiently and accurately for the learning process to get started. So if someone isn't perceiving visual information as rapidly or as accurately or as richly as they need to, or keeping things in the right order as they're coming into their brains, that is going to impair the learning process. And weaknesses there can look like behavioral problems, and students who struggle with some of these issues may be thought to be lazy or unmotivated, but it's simply because the information is just not getting efficiently into their brains. On top of the foundational cognitive skills, there are a group of skills that are now being referred to as executive functions. So these include working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And what we're going to do now is take a little deeper look at these because they're so highly predictive of everything in the chart above them. So executive functions not only are predictive of academics and social emotional intelligence, they actually are predictive of how far an individual will get academically, how much money they'll make over their lives, how healthy they will be as adults, and whether or not they will end up in jail. So these skills are very, very critical. This chart looks at these executive functions and provides a brief definition and how the skills would manifest themselves or how they would impact a student, both from an academic point of view and from a social and emotional point of view. So, for example, working memory is the ability to hold information in our mind while we think about it. Critical in academics in just about everything we do, if we're trying to solve a problem, if we're trying to read and comprehend something, we think about the information that we're taking in reading, or we think about the information in the problem that has been presented to us, and we have to keep track of where we are and how the information relates to each other, to other information that we're holding in our mind, and where we are in multi-step solution, for example, if we need to go through a number of steps. From a social or emotional point of view, holding someone else's perspective in mind, comparing and contrasting it to other points of view, and then holding in mind alternative ways to respond. So I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do that, and being able to consider multiple ways of responding. Inhibitory control is pretty self-explanatory. I think it is the ability to not do something we would otherwise do, or to suppress a thought or idea, actually to tamp down in our brain an automatic response. In academics, an example is not leaping to the first possible solution, but questioning assumptions, considering other alternatives. So our ability to stop ourselves in our tracks, if you will. And you can think about this, for example, in reading and speaking. When we're thinking of a word or a variety of ways to express a thing or a concept, there may be a variety of ways to express that. We think particularly of students who are English language learners. So when they are constructing a sentence and trying to express themselves, they may be wanting to say something about a chair. Well, they could express it in English as a chair or a seat or something else, but also they have, if they are Spanish speaking, the word silla and asiento, and those are also possible. So the ability to suppress a language and words, candidate words, when we're speaking is another very specific example of inhibitory control. Social emotional is probably even more intuitive for most of us. We think of students who are impulsive, who can't stop themselves from blurting out the answer or saying something inappropriate or blowing out the candles on somebody else's birthday cake. But also, It can refer to our ability to defer gratification over the longer term. The third executive function is cognitive flexibility. And again, that probably explains pretty much what it is: our ability to change our mind, change our mindset, or change the focus of our attention when the rules of the world around change it for us. So, for example, when we are in an academic situation, if our original approach to a problem doesn't work, then we have to be able to think of other approaches. We have to be open and flexible to shift our mind and to try something different, looking at things from different points of view. One interesting example is the process that our brains have to go through when we switch back and forth, hopefully very rapidly, between reading sight words and decoding words. Those are two different processes in our brain, and as we're reading, we may have to go back and forth between them, and hopefully we do that very fluently and very flexibly to be a good reader. From a social emotional point of view, again, looking at personal experiences from different points of view, and then being able to change direction on the basis of new information. So we don't just persist in a particular response that we have decided is what reflects our feelings, but our ability actually to shift and try a different kind of response. One of the things that has been becoming increasingly clear is the relationship and the broad acceptance of all of these factors as aspects of both academic and behavioral issues that students may be experiencing. So, for example, this is a chart that comes from a study by Digital Promise called Personalized Reading Success. And what the researchers did in this case was to look at the vast literature on reading and to identify from the literature all of the various factors that will have an impact, have been demonstrated to have an impact on development of reading skills. And so on the left, we see the standard language and literacy, alphabet knowledge, decoding, phonological awareness, sight recognition, verbal reasoning, vocabulary. So a lot of things that we think of as being associated with reading. But there are also these other three columns, and I would direct your attention particularly to the second on cognition, where attention, inhibition, and working memory down at the bottom of the list are key cognitive processes that enable and support the development of reading skills. Of course, then we have social, emotional, and student background information as well. But the point being that these are key factors in reading as well as social emotional learning. And so we need to be aware that there may be these underlying causes of some of the issues that we see in our students. Many educators think about the basics of academic subjects in the way that they have been taught to teach them. And so, for example, if I ask most educators what the basics of reading are, I will typically hear something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And indeed, these are important skills. We cannot be good readers without them, but they're also not the most basic. So, for example, there is no decoding part of our brain. In order to decode words, we have to actually use two different parts of our brain that aren't naturally connected in the way that we do. We did not evolve as human beings to read. We did evolve for language. And so we have to combine a couple of different parts of our brain to connect letters with meaning and sound. And then we also have to be able to do things like sustain our attention or visually discriminate very quickly between a B and a P or an M and an N. And so decoding requires that our brains do a bunch of different things simultaneously in coordination. The same is true for fluency. There are other cognitive processes that were in that chart that we just looked at a couple minutes ago that will impair or facilitate the development of fluency. And then when it comes to comprehension, of course, the rubber really meets the road. And here, things like visualization, our ability to create that mental image of what we're reading about, or holding information on working memory, which is actually how we create meaning and comprehend. That's our active conscious processing. And the same principles apply in math. Everything from, we probably can intuitively connect visual spatial memory, spatial representations, to the aspects of math that are similar to geometry and other kinds of physical shapes that we need to understand. But it starts even with what we might consider the very foundation of math, which is counting and numeracy and number sense. So, for example, I often think about, when I'm talking about this, my almost 5-year-old granddaughter, who has been, she could count her numbers from the time she was probably 2 or 3, and she could go zoom all the way up to 100, having really no idea what those numbers meant, but she could recite them. Now she understands more about what the numbers mean, and she can identify and count a group of things. So if you present her with a page with 12 butterflies on it, she can count those butterflies very accurately. And it's fascinating to watch her, because you can see her mind keeping track of which butterflies she's counted and which she still has to count. And she can count them very accurately. In fact, she correctly counted 18 marshmallows so that she and I could make Princess Pink popcorn from the Disney Princess Cookbook a couple of weeks ago. And then math is ultimately very logical, and so problem-solving, reasoning, keeping track of where we are in a multi-step problem are going to be important. But one of the questions that now arises is, okay, so we get that our students, these are critical skills. In the past, really, we've sort of assumed that students come to our classrooms with whatever capabilities in these areas that they have, and that we don't really have a lot of insight into how strong their various cognitive skills are. In the past, it has been very difficult and expensive to get an assessment of that, but today it is amazingly easy and affordable. This is a dashboard of student results on a cognitive assessment called MindPrint. It is administered online in an hour or less, and identifies students' strengths. So those are the green boxes, are students' strengths, and identifies their weaknesses. So red being an area that requires support, and orange being also fairly low, below typically performing in key processing areas. So, for example, if we look at student 2, we can see weaknesses in verbal and abstract reasoning. I was going to do some pretty colors here to be able to do that. And I'm going to do this. All right, so here we can see. So here's verbal reasoning, here's abstract reasoning. We can also see some weaknesses in flexible thinking, which is like cognitive flexibility that we talked before, as well as attention, and also some weaknesses in verbal memory. And so this is going to obviously have implications for this student. And then what the MindPrint system will do is to, and I'm going to undo all those so we don't have them still on the screen, look at what this means for academics. So what the system will also do then is provide this second dashboard, which correlates the cognitive assessment results with what we are likely to see consequently in academics. MindPrint is not a reading test or a math test, but provides leading indicators of potential problems. So if we look at the dashboard for student 2 again, we will see that there are weaknesses in reading, vocabulary, content, and mechanics. So reading comprehension is the second is the first red box for student 2, vocabulary, content in writing, and also mechanics in writing. Which sort of makes sense intuitively, again, because we noticed issues with verbal memory, verbal reasoning, and some other skills that are likely. But here it takes the guesswork out. So if we're seeing academic difficulties in these areas, that's a strong indication that there is a cognitive reason. So that is a non-instructional reason for this student to be struggling. The student may be receiving really good instructional materials, and the instructor may be teaching well, but the student may still not be making adequate progress because of weaker cognitive skills. Note that these weaknesses do not have to rise to the level of classification. It doesn't mean that this student needs to be in special education. In fact, it turns out that we all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Our students, ourselves, our colleagues, spouses, you're probably aware of some of those. But once we have identified this as a root cause, then we can address it. And there are two primary ways that we can address these kinds of issues. One is providing appropriate supports and strategies for the student, and the other is by working to help them actually strengthen those underlying skills so that they're become stronger and will interfere less with the learning process. And I need to get rid of my little design there again, don't I? Okay. So the mindset print system also will suggest strategies and supports for each student in the areas of expected struggles. So if I had clicked on the this vocabulary box, that red vocabulary box on the preceding page, what would come up is this list of potential strategies, the very top strategies for this particular student with these particular cognitive challenges, organized from the best on down. So you can see, like, your cell phone has got if you've got 4 bars, you're getting really good reception, and this would be a very, very good strategy. And so these are a way to get very specifically at the issues that this particular student is having. So now that we've connected cognitive skills to academics in a deeper way, what we want to do is look again at the intersection of academic and behavior issues and talk about problem solving. So recall that problem solving based on data is one of the core components where we need to address whether we're dealing with behavioral issues, academic issues, or both. And as we have seen in the discussion, they're often interrelated and often have underlying causes that may be cognitive in nature that is giving rise to both of them, although you can certainly have them arise from a number of different ways, whether it's academic causing behavioral problems causing academic, or, as we've said, these underlying issues that can often yield both kinds of problems. So good problem solving always starts with a definition of the problem. And while that seems very simple, I find that sometimes defining the problem is not altogether easy. My students often struggle with it. And because it's so basic, if you don't define the problem well, of course, the answer that you get to may not be really helpful at all. So here are some practices that my students, my clients, and I find to be very helpful. Taking the time and finding the real problem, getting different perspectives, looking for what's not there, not dressing a solution up as a problem, and understanding that well-defined solutions have alternatives. So with the first one, I always think of Albert Einstein, who is credited as saying that if he had an hour to solve a problem and his life depended on it, he would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question or the real problem, for once he understood that, he could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now, we don't all have to be Albert Einstein to benefit from this. And in fact, looking at and making sure we understand the real problem is going to be helpful no matter what kind of problem solving we're engaging in. So here's a simple example. This is a young student named Ginny. There have been reports of behavior issues in class, and they have been increasing recently. She interrupts and distracts others. She moves out of the teacher's sight in the classroom. We've also noticed, and the teacher has noticed, that her double scores have not increased in the last 2 months. Now, this could be a behavioral problem that is simply interfering and she's not spending the time reading, or it could be that her reading is a problem and that could be having academic. So we really need to try to figure out which is which and sort this out. We need to answer the age-old question of whether it's the chicken or the egg. Are academic struggles causing behavior problems or vice versa? And of course, we need to know that because the solutions that we come up with are going to be different. So we can look again at whether these are interrelated problems or independent problems, and that will help us in terms of how we're going to address them. So one of the questions that I find to be very powerful in defining problems is to say to yourself, what would have to be true? So what would have to be true if behavior is the cause? What would have to be true if academics are the cause of Ginny's issues? What would we expect to see if behavior is the root cause? What would we expect to see if academics are the root cause? And when we start to think about it that way, then we can test our hypotheses. A problem definition is, in a lot of regards, simply a hypothesis. And we can test that by using this question. So I'm going to give you a little more information because these are the kinds of things that we might investigate if we had a problem and a student to deal with like Ginny. And what we've been able to determine is that Ginny's unwanted behaviors occur most commonly during silent sustained reading. And we also know, because we have done a little bit of investigating, that her low scores on dibbles are primarily due to substituting words with the same initial sound. So for example, if she is reading the word great, she might say green. So something that starts with the same letter, but it's obviously not the word that is intended. So in this case, it seems likely, or seems pretty possible at least, that Ginny is avoiding reading tasks. So she's acting out, she's distracting, she's crawling out of the teacher's line of sight during silent sustained reading because she wants to avoid that task, because it's a task that she finds difficult and unpleasant. And of course, none of us want to do tasks that are difficult and unpleasant, and that tends to result in behavior problems. Now, this is a little bit of a fictitious example, but I think hopefully lets you look at the question of what would have to be true. So we would expect these kinds of things to be true if the underlying cause was academic, that was resulting in sort of behavioral issues that we're also seeing. The second practice I want to talk about a little is getting multiple perspectives. And this may seem obvious. We've all heard that 2 heads are better than 1. We've all probably seen the benefit of getting advice from others. But I also find that my clients and my students, and sometimes even I, have a tendency to jump to a problem and a solution that seem obvious to them or obvious to me because of our mental models. And so this is a little cartoon that talks about the impact of mental models. So this is an old Indian fable where you have a bunch of blind men, 6 blind men, and are all looking at and experiencing different parts of an elephant. And because they are all in different places on this elephant, they are seeing and guessing that it is a snake, a tree, a cave, a branch, a mountain, or a faded leaf. And of course, it is none of those things. Obviously, it is an elephant. So if they were able to pool their perspectives, they might do a little bit better. So here is an example from a real school that we worked with, although I've changed the name of the school. So here I'm calling it Central Elementary in Anywhere, USA. And this is a school, like many, where reading scores have been consistently below grade level for several years. And in this particular year, the school and the teachers and the principal introduced a new intervention that, based on available evidence, was expected to help improve overall scores and the percentage of students reading at grade level. The intervention was used in grades 2, second grade through 5th grade. So everyone was, looking forward to seeing the end of year reading benchmarks, where students in 3rd through 5th grades achieved the expected gains, but surprisingly, students in 2nd grade did not. And in fact, many of them did not even do as well on their end of year DIBELS test as they had at the beginning. So the question, or the basic problem facing the principal and the teachers in the school is, should they continue the intervention next year in 2nd grade? Is the intervention just not working for 2nd graders, or is there something else going on? So the obvious answer is, well, it didn't work for 2nd graders, we won't do it again. But the principal decided that that really didn't make sense, and so she got a group together. She assembled some teachers, she assembled the testing administrator, and basically asked everybody for their perspective. And they looked a little more deeply at the list of students because it was not consistent in 2nd grade. Some students' performance improved and some students' performance stayed the same or declined between the fall and the spring administration of DIBELS. Now, the 2nd grade teacher said that the students on this list, she was surprised that they hadn't done better because they seemed to be doing pretty well with reading in class. The testing administrator looked at her records, and one of the things that she was able to see is that the spring and fall DIBELS assessments were administered by 2 different people. The 2nd grade teacher administered in the fall, and the stranger, someone who'd come in from outside the school, in the spring. And what the principal concluded and the teacher concluded is that those students who did not perform well would just have been very uncomfortable. They were shyer, they were more reticent, they weren't as confident in their skills, they were more concerned about making mistakes. And so they would have been very uncomfortable reading aloud to a stranger and wouldn't have done well on the test. And so that helped inform their decision for the following year. The third problem definition practice that I want to talk a little bit about is to look for what's not there, as in this optical illusion. So I'm hoping that you can see that white triangle in the middle, but of course there's no triangle there, except if we look at the spaces between the objects. So we have to sometimes look for what's not there rather than for what is there. So again, we're going to look at some intervention data. In fact, this is pre and post-test data for a cognitive training intervention called BrainWare Safari. And the data come from the Mind Print assessment that we referred to earlier. And what we're seeing here is for 2 different schools, we're seeing these are the percentile point changes between the pre-test and the post-test. And so if you look at the blue bars across the board, you can see that the students in School 1 saw significant gains across all of the tests, with an average 21 percentile point gain for all students on the test. Students at School 2 gained an average of 5 percentile points, and as you can see, while there was some improvement, it certainly, in general, was not at the scale or to the degree that students in School 1. So why? And now it's one of those examples of where we need to look for what wasn't there. And what wasn't there, as in many situations, was fidelity of implementation. So the target number of sessions for the BrainWare Safari implementation is 3 times a week for 10 to 14 weeks. And so we would have wanted to see at least 30 sessions. So the target sessions of 30, and you can see that School 1 with 35 sessions met that target number of sessions, while School 2 did not. And that's reflected also in the number of levels completed in the program, although in the case of a cognitive intervention, we are always focused more on the sessions and the frequency and intensity of usage. I should just stop and say, by the way, that if you are interested in information either on the MindPrint cognitive assessment or more information on BrainWare Safari, please feel free to send us an email on that. Again, I will provide my email at the end and would look forward to having more conversation about this if this is something you're interested in. And finally, what I advise my students and my clients, and I keep reminding myself, is not to dress a solution up as a problem, and to remember that well-defined problems have alternative solutions. And these are sort of two sides of the same coin, and definitely relate to each other. So consider this problem statement. We need more math textbooks for the 3rd grade. So we've looked at information, whatever information we have, and someone has said, we need more textbooks for the 3rd grade. So what is the obvious solution? Of course, get more textbooks for the 3rd grade. What alternatives come to mind? Not a whole lot. And in fact, someone is likely to say, well, we don't have the money for it, or the textbooks are old, or whatever. But it's focusing very much on the textbooks as opposed to necessarily the underlying problem. So often when you see a sentence that includes we need, we should, we must, we have to, you're actually dressing up a solution as a problem. So making the textbooks the problem rather than whatever the underlying. So we might have looked at some data and we might have concluded that the problem is really more accurately or more usefully stated as this. The 3rd grade students performed inconsistently on the most recent math test. Some students did not have math textbooks to use when the class covered some of the concepts covered on the test. So when we phrase the question this way, then we get a variety of alternatives. And my guess is, as experienced educators, many of you have a number of solutions that come to mind. Sharing textbooks, using free resources, a variety of other kinds of activities, rotating students around through different experiences so that we can ensure that they do have exposure to and engagement in those concepts that they need to learn for the test. That wouldn't have been obvious if we'd had to wait for next year for the budget to give us our math textbooks. So today what we've done is we've discussed the role of cognitive skills in both academic and behavioral problems. And we've seen that underlying cognitive strengths and weaknesses will have an impact on our students' performance and as well as their behavior in our classrooms and hallways and gyms and cafeterias, and as well as their long-term life outcomes and success. We focused on one of the common core components in academic and behavioral multi-tiered systems of support, that is problem solving, starting with the basic fundamental step that we need to take in solving a problem, which is defining it. And we've shared some of the problem definition practices that I find helpful and that I sometimes will take as a little checklist. We certainly do this in my MBA classes whenever we're defining a problem. We remind each other of this when we're solving a problem or addressing and trying to define in our business, and can play an important role in taking that first step in problem solving in a multi-tiered system of support. So if you have questions, obviously we are not physically and simultaneously connected. at the moment, but I certainly welcome your questions. I welcome your comments and thoughts. Would love to hear what you have to say about it. And here is my contact information. Feel free to email me at bhill@mybrainware.com. You have my phone number. Would welcome connecting on LinkedIn, and you have information on how to find us on Facebook and our website. So thank you so much for taking a little time out of your very busy schedule to spend thinking about these issues today. I hope you found this relevant and have taken away some tips and some tricks and some information perhaps that you would like to implement in your everyday practices in working on multi-tiered systems of support. So I hope you'll join us again for another webinar, and thanks again for joining us today. Bye-bye.